Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 60 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Did George Washington really start the French and Indian War? Why should we remember a battle that took place over 260 years ago? Today, we investigate the answers to those questions as we explore the Battle of the Monongahela with David Preston, the West Vaco Professor of National Security Studies at the Citadel and author of Braddocks Defeat, the Battle of the Monongahela and the Road to Revolution. During our exploration, David reveals where the Battle of the Monongahela took place and why it happened, the roles that British, French, and Native American soldiers and warriors played in the battle, and why we should investigate and think about the Battle of the Monongahela when it took place over 260 years ago. But first, are you looking for that perfect holiday gift for your loved one? Why not give them the gift of history? Give them the Ben Franklin's World app. This app will allow them to access and listen to every episode of Ben Franklin's World, and the best part, the app is free. To download the app, search for Ben Franklin's World in the Google Play or iTunes app stores, or visit benfranklinsworld.com/apps. Oh, and while you're at it, why don't you go ahead and download a copy of the app for yourself? Think of it as my holiday gift to you. Now, without further ado, let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest today is the West Vaco Professor of National Security Studies at the Citadel. His research interests include war and peace among the French, British, and Native American peoples of North America during the 18th century. He is an avid Pittsburgh Steelers fan and the author of 2 books, The Texture of Contact, European and Indian Settler Communities on the Frontiers of Iroquois, 1667 to 1783, and, most recently, Braddocks Defeat, the Battle of the Monongahela and the Road to Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, David Preston.
Thank you, Liz. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you.
David, you've just written a rather comprehensive study on the Battle of the Monongahela. This battle took place 260 years ago. As warfare has changed so much between the mid-18th century and our own 21st century, would you tell us why it is important that we remember this battle?
Certainly, and that's a wonderful question. The Battle of the Monongahela, also known as Braddock's Defeat, is really the most important and consequential battle in American history before 1775. It was one of the worst military disasters in the history of the British Army, and its consequences were enormous for subsequent American history, both in the way that it shaped the French and Indian War, the way that it shaped warfare in America, and the ways that it shaped westward expansion. One of the things that I think we're going to talk about later is the military road that General Braddock constructed across the Appalachian Mountains, which had consequences for the subsequent settlement of the Ohio Valley and for the native peoples who lived there. The battle itself is important and still relevant to this day in the sense that this battle very much highlighted the clash of conventional and unconventional warfare in a tribal context. This was a clash that featured a conventional British army, powerful, disciplined, armed with artillery, against primarily native warriors, the French and the Indian forces that defeated Braddock at the Monongahela. The vast majority of them were native warriors. And there are still some very relevant lessons from this battle that can be applied to today. And I would just highlight them in this order. First of all, we still have, as we have seen in recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, that basic tension between conventional and unconventional warfare. Both the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were wars that happened in a tribal context. Finally, the story of Braddock's expedition is, I think, a reminder of decision-making in war, that both the British and the French in this period were rather blithe in their confidence that military force could solve problems and that it could be applied without escalating into a broader conflict. And that is precisely what happened for the British and the French empires in North America in 1754 and 55. So it's, in essence, bottom line is Braddocks Defeat is an example of what can go wrong when military force is committed.
Okay, you've convinced us. The Battle of Monongahela has important implications for our own day. Let's begin our discussion of this battle by looking at it from a bird's eye view. Would you provide us with an overview of the Battle of the Monongahela?
Certainly. The battle occurred on July the 9th, 1755, and part of the drama of this battle is that the British had gotten so close to their ultimate destination, which was the French fort called Fort Duquesne, which is located at what was called the Forks of the Ohio River. That is modern-day Pittsburgh. The British had gotten to within about 10 to 12 miles of Fort Duquesne. They were very confident that another march would put them within striking distance of the fort with their artillery. Spirits were high within the army. And the battle occurred in the afternoon of July 9th, shortly after the British had crossed the Monongahela River. And if there was any point at which the British expected to be attacked, it was at that crossing of the Monongahela, where the army would have been very vulnerable trying to get across the river with an enemy on the other side. The French and the Indians were not there when the British Army crossed at about noon on July 9th, and that added to this sense of expectation that a short march in the next day would bring them to victory. So on the cusp of victory, the British, once they had recommenced their march after the river crossing, they found themselves attacked by a very large French and Indian force. And as I mentioned before, more than 2/3 of the French and Indian force was composed of Indian warriors. And again, part of the drama of the Battle of Braddocks Defeat, or the Monongahela, is how quickly this confident army, seemingly on the cusp of victory, was essentially reduced to a mob within the space of about 4 hours. And the very grim toll of this battle for the British can be seen in the casualties. Literally 2/3 of Braddock's entire force, of roughly about 14,000 men, is killed or wounded in the space of those 4 hours. So very grim odds if you're a British soldier. That means that 2 out of every 3 soldiers who cross the river will not come back in one piece. And again, that's partly why this remains to this day one of the worst military disasters in the history of the British Army, and indeed all of military history.
Some historians suggest that the Battle of the Monongahela began a year before it took place with the Jumonville Affair of May 1754. Would you tell us about the Jumonville Affair and whether it is accurate to start the story of Braddock's defeat with it?
Yes, the Jumonville Affair in 1754 was very much an event that helped to precipitate Braddock's expedition to America in the first place. And so here I would comment on the importance of establishing the broader context of the British government's decision in 1754 to dispatch General Braddock along with 2 regiments of the regular British Army. And indeed, that's exactly where I begin my story, essentially, is the broader contest for the Ohio Valley among the Indians of that region, the French and the British. This area, the Ohio Valley, had emerged as the most strategic point in America, partly because of the imperial rivalry between the British and the French, but partly because of the trade opportunities that the region offered. The actual struggle, military struggle for the Ohio Valley begins in 1753. And it's very telling that the French struck first militarily in trying to establish control over this region. And one of the things that really surprised me in my research was to learn that in 1753, a year before the Jumonville Affair, the French had sent around 2,600 men under the command of an officer named Morin to invade the Ohio Valley and establish French fortifications to anchor their control. This large French force of 2,600 men was actually larger by a hair than General Braddock's entire army that would come 2 years hence. So we have to understand that there is a context of French military invasion of the Ohio Valley in 1753. And that is what helps to precipitate the Jumonville Affair in 1754. Virginia, the colony of Virginia, which had been the most active in advancing the interests of the British Empire on the frontier, was really the first to try to assert British control in that region. And there were both diplomatic as well as military efforts to do so. George Washington famously ventured into the wilderness in 1753 to hand deliver a diplomatic summons to the French to depart from the Ohio Valley, essentially warning them that this was territory claimed by the King of Great Britain, George II. When the French, sitting in their fortifications out there, said no, Washington returned to Virginia, and in 1754, the Virginia governor, Royal Governor Robert Dinwiddie, authorizes military action. And so it's in that context that Washington again returns to the Ohio Valley. In 1754, Washington was an officer in what is called the Virginia Regiment, and he enters a very volatile climate in the spring of 1754. Now, it's become fashionable among scholars of the French and Indian War to make the Jumonville Affair the beginning of hostilities. It's often said that Washington fired the first shots of the entire French and Indian War, which, as we know, became a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. So in some respects, it's become fashionable to blame Washington for the advent of hostilities. However, that ignores the fact that the French had already militarily invaded the Ohio Valley in 1753, and the month before the Jumonville Affair, in April of 1754, the French had actually militarily seized a British outpost at the forks of the Ohio called Trent's Fort. In my mind, those were the first shots, if you will, of the French and Indian War, but this was a bloodless conquest. The French sent, again, an incredibly large force of 600 men and over a dozen cannon to conquer this British outpost, little fledgling outpost. And it's important to note that this was April 1754, about a month before the Jumonville Affair. Washington enters the Ohio Valley believing that essentially a state of war is already in existence. And when he learns of a French party that is coming towards his position, he decisively acts, and he, along with his Indian allies, organizes essentially an ambush of this small French party. It's interesting that Washington's first military action, if you will, is an ambush, not some type of conventional open field engagement. So the Jumonville Affair occurs in late May of 1754, and this British and Indian party is very quickly able to subdue the French. Only one French Marine, or militiaman, I should say, will survive the action and make it back to Fort Duquesne to relate the news. The Jumonville Affair became an infamous moment because the French commander of that party, the Sieur de Jumonville, was wounded in the action And he is later dispatched by Washington's principal Indian ally called the Half King. And so the French make the most of this incident diplomatically. And Washington is famously accused of being an assassin who presided over the killing of this French officer. I would hasten to say, though, that the Jumonville Affair could have easily been a skirmish, perhaps even an infamous skirmish, but it did not necessarily precipitate open warfare between France and Great Britain. And that is where the British government's decision in late 1754 to commit regular British forces is very important. In my view, Braddock's expedition is much more significant in terms of escalating the larger conflict that we know of as the French and Indian War. And when Braddock loses, when his expedition is defeated and turned back, again, that escalates the fighting even more. And it results in even more British regulars being sent over to America to help stabilize a situation that's increasingly going out of control.
Here on Ben Franklin's World, we have visited the Ohio Valley before. Colin Calloway took us there in the 1790s with the Victory of No Name, when Americans are trying to expand out to the Ohio Valley and Native American coalitions stop them. Is the Jumonville Affair the first clash between the French and British, or between Europeans or Euro-Americans and Native Americans?
That's a wonderful question. This whole story of the contest for the Ohio Valley, of course, has a much broader context and a much deeper history. The French, in particular, had for decades began to rely on the military power represented in their alliances with native nations. And one of the most significant findings in my book was the fact that the French and Indian coalition that defeated Braddock was composed of not only French Marines and militia, but as many as 20 different Indian nations or communities that were drawn from most of northeastern North America. There was a large contingent, for example, of Canadian Iroquois drawn from the St. Lawrence Valley. There was also a large contingent, as many as a third of those Indian warriors fighting against Braddock were drawn from a region that's called the Pays d'Anneau, or the Upper Country, also known as the Great Lakes region. There were also contingents of natives drawn from the Ohio Valley itself, groups like the Delawares, the Shawnees, Ohio Iroquois, Miamis, who were very concerned about the advent of a British army in their region, on their lands. And one of the things that makes the Battle of the Monongahela so distinctive is that this very much was an unprecedented type of battle. When we look backward at previous British and French and Indian conflicts, there's really no prior example of a large, regular British army fighting essentially against an army of Indians. And that's very much what Braddock encountered on July the 9th, 1755. This was an army, a battle that pitched British redcoats, again, primarily against Indian light infantry. And the Indians were very quickly able to gain the upper hand on these supposedly disciplined and superior British infantry.
The Ohio Valley is important. The Battle of the Monongahela is important. Would you tell us about Edward Braddock, the general the British appointed to oversee their hopes in the Ohio Valley region, and the man whose name became synonymous with the Battle of the Monongahela?
Edward Braddock is probably one of the most maligned commanders in all of military history. And one could probably write a book on the number of myths that surround this individual. He was, in the aftermath of the Monongahela, accused of all sorts of wrongdoing. And so part of the struggle in my book was very much to cut through not just myths believed by subsequent historians, but indeed to cut through some of these accusations made against him in his own time. What I found in my research is that Edward Braddock was an experienced career officer in the British Army. He was born in 1694. His father was also in the British Army, and Braddock actually received his commission in the year 1710 in a unit, an elite unit known as the Coldstream Guards. Over the next few decades, Braddock gains a lot of experience. While he does not ever taste battle before July 9th, 1755, Braddock had participated in a number of campaigns in the wars of Europe. For example, the War of Austrian Succession in the 1740s. Braddock was a competent officer, and he was entrusted with command of a regiment in the early 1750s, and he was also the lieutenant governor of the British garrison of Gibraltar in 1753 and 54. Previous scholars have very much ignored this important command experience that Braddock had at Gibraltar. And so in the British National Archives, I did quite a bit of research on Braddock's tenure at Gibraltar, and I found that he acquitted himself very well. And not only did he acquit himself well, but he gained great experience in the very type of context that he would encounter in America. For example, at Gibraltar, this was a heavily fortified garrison, and Braddock gained immense knowledge of siege warfare, which is exactly the type of warfare that he would have to employ in America to besiege all of these different French forts located on the Ohio Valley frontier. He also gained a lot of experience in diplomacy during his command at Gibraltar. He had to deal with civilian authorities, with merchants, with a very multi-ethnic population. And again, that is precisely the type of environment that Braddock would encounter in America. He would have to deal with colonial governments that were sometimes uncooperative. He had to be a diplomat to Indian nations and emissaries. And so I found that rather than seeing Braddock as this inexperienced, arrogant commander who comes over here with no knowledge of America and almost inevitably fails, I found that Braddock was a competent officer. He actually conducted an excellent campaign. The real tragedy of Braddock, of course, is that he failed as he was literally on the cusp of victory.
We've met General Braddock. Now let's meet his French opponents. David, would you tell us about Braddock's French counterpart?
Yes, the overall commander in the Ohio Valley, the commandant of Fort Duquesne, was a French Marine captain by the name of Claude-Pierre Pécaudie de Contrecoeur. The French commander on the battlefield on July 9th was also a French Marine officer, and he was, in my mind, one of the most distinguished and most combat-seasoned officers that I encountered among the French during my research. His name was Captain Beaujeu, Daniel Hyacinthe Marie Léonard de Beaujeu, and he was tragically killed in the initial volleys during the Battle of the Monongahela. But as I found in my research, it was Beaujeu that very much established the basic tactical plan for defeating Braddock on the day of the battle. Strangely enough, Braddock's defeat is one of those battles that previous scholars have studied almost exclusively from the British perspective. There has never been a volume that has exhaustively researched either the French or the Indian perspectives on this. It reminds me in many ways of the story that the Civil War General George Pickett told. At one point after the Civil War, he was asked about his famous charge at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, and apparently people were quizzing him about what mistakes the Confederates had made during the battle and who was to blame. Was it Robert E. Lee? Was it James Longstreet, etc.? And Pickett allegedly responded, "Well, I always thought the Yankees had something to do with it." And that's essentially how I found the scholarship on Braddocks Defeat. It had been very much Anglo-centric, focused on the mistakes that the British had made. And indeed, the very name Braddocks Defeat suggests that this was a battle that was Braddock's to lose. But I did an immense amount of research on the French and the Indian sides of the expedition, the forces that actually won the battle. And what I found in particular about the French opponents is the French officers who were at the Monongahela in 1755 were extraordinarily experienced. And one of the things that I found in my research was a listing by surname of all of the French officers who participated in the Battle of the Monongahela. And using that list, I was able to do some prosopography and look at their careers in America, in New France, before 1755. And I was really astonished at the degree of military and combat and diplomatic experience that a lot of these French officers carried with them. So, for example, both Captains Contrecoeur and Beaujeu had been stationed at different outposts all across New France. And at those outposts, they gained experience in diplomacy with native peoples. These French officers gained experience in fighting alongside native warriors in previous expeditions against the British. Captain Beaujeu, for example, was very much a combat-tested veteran, and I found a lot of evidence in his career in the War of the 1740s, known as in America as King George's War. Beaujeu was one of those officers who essentially runs to the sound of the gunfire. And in fact, in one of Beaujeu's journals from the 1740s, he describes a battle in which he participated. And he uses that very phrase that at one point we ran towards the sound of the gunfire that we heard. And this all very much changes our understanding of the Monongahela or Braddock's defeat. In many ways, this battle was more Beaujeu's victory than Braddock's defeat. And rather than focusing on the alleged blunders that the British committed, we can instead change our perspective and look at the incredible leadership and tactical skill and experience that both the French and the Indians brought to that battlefield.
As David mentioned, the Battle of the Monongahela was not just a battle between French and British forces. Many Native Americans also fought during the battle. David, would you tell us about the Native American warriors who fought at the Battle of the Monongahela and what roles they played in the battle?
Yes. As I mentioned before, there were as many as 20 different Indian nations or specific communities represented at the Battle of the Monongahela. One of the challenges of writing on the 18th century, a challenge that ethnohistorians are particularly aware of, is how do you write about an event in which there are no extant and authentic Indian sources? There is not, in fact, a single account of the battle, either written or recorded, of a native participant. And this was indeed a formidable challenge. And the way that I was able to learn about the actions of native warriors in the battle itself was to examine closely the numerous French accounts and even more numerous British accounts of the battle. The French, for example, they often commented on the movements and the actions of the Indians during the battle. And the British sources also indicated what the Indians were doing. And I also was fortunate enough to discover an entirely new French account of the Monongahela that gave me immense insight into what both the French and the Indians were doing. For a long time, there was essentially a gap in our understanding of the French and the Indian side of the battle. And that is, there was very little information in French sources as to what happened from the moment that Captain Beaujeu and his forces departed Fort Duquesne until the moment that they made contact with the British. This new account that I found, which was located at the Archives du Calvados in Caen, in France, it very much was the missing link, and it provided me with new insights on both the leadership of Captain Beaujeu as well as the actions of Indian warriors. So, for example, from this new account, I learned that Captain Beaujeu had sent out Indian scouts ahead of his advance in order to gain intelligence of the British location and their exact disposition. So this account states that the Indians returned. They informed Beaujeu of the disposition of the British column, and the description is incredibly accurate, and it really matches what I know of the British column from British sources. It also contained an incredible nugget of information that Captain Beaujeu had informed the Indians. He directed the Indians to essentially fan out onto the flanks of the British column and to wait there until he, with his French forces, had engaged the British head on. And so, in many ways, the French and the Indian attack it's a head-on attack, but it's also an ambush at the same time. Beaujeu instructed the Indian allies fighting with him to withhold their fire until he had engaged the British. Another really key detail in the document was that the French had attached an officer or a cadet who was familiar with the Indian language of whatever war party or group. There was a French officer of some kind attached to each Indian group. And so that helped to facilitate control and communication on the French and the Indian side. Now, what the Indians did in particular that was decisive is that in the initial moments of the battle, Captain Beaujeu's attack that I just mentioned, it actually fails. The British, while they are definitely surprised by this unknown force coming at them, they are able to hold their ground. And as I mentioned previously, Captain Beaujeu himself goes down. He is instantly killed with a shot to the head. The French accounts say in the third volley that's fired during the battle. So almost instantly, the French commander goes down. And the Indians at that point very much take control of the battle. And what they're doing is essentially driving along the sides or the flanks of the British column, and they're driving very deep towards the rear of the British column. And Braddock found himself, because of that, in a very disadvantageous position. So I very much credit the actions of Indian warriors as being very decisive in the battle. And ultimately, the Battle of the Monongahela is a reflection of the very real military power that Indian nations still possessed in the mid-18th century.
One of the most interesting aspects to me about Braddock's defeat was the logistical challenges that Braddock faced even before he got to the battle. In Braddocks Defeat, David notes how the British had to bring all the artillery, camp equipment, food, and personnel they needed to capture Fort Duquesne to Fort Duquesne. And David actually walked and investigated some of the routes that Braddock and his men had to cart their equipment across. So, David, I wonder if you could talk about the logistical challenges that Braddock and his equipage train faced and what the terrain of Braddock's Road looks like.
It was very much an epiphany for me to actually trace the route of Braddock's expedition, which began in Alexandria, Virginia, and then proceeded across the Appalachian Mountains. a distance of nearly 300 miles. It was one thing to read about some of these arduous passages up ridges and down ridges. But when I actually got to places like Big Savage Mountain or the Shades of Death or Meadow Mountain, and to see these incredibly steep climbs that the British had to make, it truly revolutionized my view of the sources. And it certainly gave me a more visceral sense of the hardships that the British Army faced in this expedition. The British constructed a military road ranging in width from about 10 to 12 feet. They constructed a military road from a place called Fort Cumberland, which is present-day Cumberland, Maryland. And they constructed this military road across the Appalachian or the Allegheny Mountains for a distance of 115 miles. And the reason that the British had to construct this military road, a wagon road essentially, is because they had to transport this artillery that they were carrying across the mountains in order to besiege the French forts in the Ohio Valley. The French forts that were constructed in 1753-54, they were strong enough that they really required siege artillery in order to be captured. And Braddock essentially brings the bare minimum amount of artillery that's needed. At one point during the march, he actually split his column in half, and he takes a smaller, more mobile column ahead, again with just the essential artillery that he thought was required. Because they are moving essentially through woods, there are no places in which the British forces can be resupplied. And for that reason, they had to bring everything with them. They had to bring enough food to sustain themselves for at least a short time in the event that they were able to capture Fort Duquesne. So logistics were incredibly difficult for the British. And indeed, Braddock's expedition almost never got off the ground. One of the things that I discuss in the book is the very critical role that the young Benjamin Franklin played in the expedition. And it was Franklin who was able to secure for Braddock's army enough horses and wagons just to continue the advance at all. So it's in many ways a small miracle that Braddock's expedition even got started. And it's indeed a miracle that the British were able to get across these rugged mountains so quickly. One of the myths about Braddock's march is that it was this slow, methodical, plodding advance where the army only made a few miles a day. But when you actually look at the terrain and the enormous ridges and steep drops and river crossings that the army is going over, it's truly incredible that they made such rapid progress. In my mind, Braddock's march is actually one of the most rapid marches in all of early American military history. Now, another thing that I did was to explore the French lines of communication and supply. And of course, for the French, because they typically dominated the important river networks and certainly the Great Lakes region, this was not done on foot, but rather in a canoe. So I canoed the important French lines of communication being French Creek, which they called Rivière au Boeuf, and the Allegheny River, which they referred to as La Belle Rivière, the beautiful river. And one of the most surprising things that I found in my research was how tenuous and challenging logistics were for the French. I think that one of the misconceptions that's out there in many histories today is that the French, because they had access to a lot of the important waterways of North America, that they could more easily move forces from point A to point B, that they could more easily get supplies from, say, Montreal down to Fort Duquesne. I found incredibly rich French sources on the voyage that Captain Beaujeu made beginning in April of 1755 from Montreal. And Beaujeu is leading a number of convoys of reinforcements and supplies down to Fort Duquesne. It's an odyssey of over 700 miles. And Beaujeu and these convoys have to go up the St. Lawrence River. They have to cross Lake Ontario. They have to portage, that is to say, take all of their canoes, all of their supplies and goods out of their canoes, carry them across land at Niagara. And then they have to go across Lake Erie. And then they have to portage again in what is now northern Pennsylvania near Erie. And I found that the French were almost brought to the point of exhaustion by these portages, and the delays that those portages created for the French meant that Beaujeu and his forces did not arrive at Fort Duquesne until literally about 1 week to 2 weeks before the battle. And that is crucial because it's such crucial timing. If Braddock had arrived a week earlier, or if the French had been delayed another week, the whole story of this expedition would have been changed.
David, before we move into the time warp, I have a few listener questions for you. You've already mentioned that George Washington was present at the Jumonville Affair and during Braddock's defeat. Patrick would like to know how Braddock's defeat at the Battle of the Monongahela contributed to Washington's military and leadership skills. Did the battle influence any of the actions that Washington took during the War for Independence?
That is a phenomenal question. I love the question. Washington was profoundly influenced by his participation in the Battle of the Monongahela, and it is very much an action that I think seared certain lessons on his mind. And I would start with the shocking nature of Braddock's defeat, that, again, this army, which seemingly was disciplined, powerful, could literally come unraveled and be turned into a mob in the space of 4 hours. So one of the lessons for Washington, I think, was discipline. He famously said that discipline is the soul of the army. And in his subsequent commands in the French and Indian War, as well as in the Revolutionary War, he certainly insisted on having a disciplined force. At the same time, Washington did not intend to slavishly imitate the British Army. And I think that that's a mistake that many historians make when they talk about Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Washington certainly did want a conventional army that could go toe-to-toe with the British Army. But having experienced Braddock's defeat, Washington gained a very healthy respect for Indian tactics. And as I argue in the book, Washington's Continental Army was essentially a kind of hybrid force. On the one hand, you had that core of Continental Army regulars, but Washington also and consistently cooperates with groups that we might call unconventional or irregular, militia, riflemen, Indian allies. So Washington never really loses his respect for the Indians that he faced at Braddock's defeat.
Michael would like to know more about Tanacharison, who is the Native American leader Half-King that you mentioned earlier. Michael says that Tanacharison, the Half-King, named George Washington Conotucarius. Would you tell us who Tanacharison is and how he came to know Washington and about his presenting Washington with a Native American name?
That's also a wonderful question. Tanacharison was an Iroquois official who was living in the Ohio Valley in the 1740s. He was reportedly the offspring of Catawba and Seneca Indian parentage. The name Half-King was also given to Tanacharison by the British, who very much saw this Indian official as essentially the spokesperson for all of the Indian groups living in the region. according to George Washington's accounts, in 1753, the half-king refers to Washington by an Iroquoian name, Conoticarius, which is variously translated as town taker or destroyer of towns. And it is incredibly fascinating that Tanacrisson would apply this name to Washington, because it is in fact the same Iroquoian name that had been given to Washington's great-grandfather, Colonel George Washington, in 1675. It's very much, I think, a testament to the oral memory of Native peoples that they knew of this connection between George Washington and his ancestor. The irony of all this is that John Washington in 1675 is involved in an action that eerily foreshadows the Jumonville Affair that George Washington would participate in 1754. In 1675, Colonel John Washington was involved in the killings of 5 Susquehannock Indians during an actual truce in the middle of conflict. In a similar way, in the Jumonville Affair, George Washington would be accused of presiding over the killing of a French officer who, in the French view, was coming in the character of a diplomat who was simply delivering a warning to Washington to not trespass on the lands of the King of France. So I suppose the lesson is that history does indeed repeat itself.
In Poor Richard's Club, which is our community of Ben Franklin's World listeners on Facebook, Michael and Kata had a debate about what Braddock bequeathed to Washington on his deathbed. Was it his sword or his red sash of command? And what did the object that Braddock gave Washington mean to Washington?
That is also a wonderful question that I've pondered. General Braddock was mortally wounded during the battle, and Washington was a member of Braddock's staff. Washington was a volunteer aide to the general. And by the end of the battle, the general's staff had been so shot up that Washington was the sole unwounded aide that Braddock had left. And so, in many respects, Washington does inherit command in a sense. Washington is the aide who would be transmitting the general's orders. Washington also was with the general, carrying him off the field, and indeed they used the sash, the general's sash, for one of its intended purposes. This was a type of sash called a sprung sash, and a few individuals taking a corner of it could literally lift a wounded man's body off the field on the sash. And I'm certain that in the days that followed, Washington would remember that sash and the general's final moments. Braddock would die a few days following the battle, and Washington did indeed come to possess the deceased general's sash. But Washington never said specifically what the sash meant to him, but I suspect that it simply reminded him of these searing lessons that I've mentioned. One of the interesting responses of Washington to the Monongahela is that he very much saw it in a religious light. He said in a letter to a friend, "See the wondrous works of providence, the uncertainty of human things." And I think that ultimately that's what the Monongahela meant to him, that this was somehow an event, a shocking event, an unexpected event, but somehow it was ordered by providence. It seared him with a sense of the uncertainty of human things. And when you think about the broader changes that were happening in the British world in the mid-18th century, and certainly by the time of the American Revolution, this was a generation of Americans who had seen that a lot of things were uncertain, perhaps even things like monarchy, which people accepted as second nature.
Let's transition to the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
the Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In Braddocks Defeat, David points out that after the Battle of the Monongahela, the French position weakened as both French soldiers removed back to Montreal and Quebec, and Native American warriors went home. David, in your opinion, what might have happened if the British had sent out another expedition to Fort Duquesne? Would the British have secured the Ohio Valley and the riverine confluence of the Ohio, Monongahela, and Allegheny rivers?
This is an actual historical possibility that you're raising. Following Braddock's disaster, the Royal Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, as well as the Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America, who inherited Braddock's position, Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, both of these individuals advocated renewing an expedition to try to take Fort Duquesne. Dinwiddie, in fact, sensed that there was a probability that the Indians had gone home and that they might be able to catch the French in a much weakened state. So it's very much a historical possibility. The real question is, did the British have the capability in the summer or fall of 1755 to renew that advance? Probably not, in the sense that the remnants of Braddock's army were just that. They were shattered remnants. I was very much astonished at the level of casualties in Braddock's forces. Many of the leading officers in Braddock's regiments had been killed or wounded. But most importantly, at the Battle of the Monongahela, the British lost their entire train of siege artillery. And so that was one of the vital things that you would need in order to renew the advance on Fort Duquesne.
David, what's next for you? Will you still be researching aspects of War and Peace between the British, the French, and Native Americans in 18th century North America?
Yes, I have two projects that I'm working on currently. One is a study of the Canada and New York frontier, centering on the area of Saratoga, which was a key settlement in that region. I'm also planning a sequel to Braddock's Defeat, which will look at the subsequent expedition in 1758 called Forbes's expedition, which results in the British successfully capturing Fort Duquesne and undoing the stigma of Braddock's defeat. And what I especially want to emphasize about that 1758 is how crucial it is in terms of establishing British control in the Trans-Appalachian West.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how we can get in contact with you?
Readers are most welcome to email me if they have questions about my books. My office number is also located on the Citadel's website in the Department of History. And I look forward to entertaining any questions that readers may have.
David, thank you so much for telling us about the Battle of the Monongahela and reminding us why it is so important that we study it today.
Thank you again, Liz. It's been my pleasure, and I certainly appreciated your wonderful questions. And finally, go Steelers.
Many scholars argue that George Washington started the French and Indian War with his participation in the Jumonville Affair in 1754. As we just heard, David disagrees. He contends that the French and English had been fighting with each other for North American territory for nearly a century before the French and Indian War, and that the French provoked the English by moving its military into the Ohio Valley first. This is an interesting perspective, and one that I think merits our further consideration. Also, how about that road Braddock's men had to build just to reach Fort Duquesne? David's description of the road and his excursions along it make me wonder whether the French soldiers and Native American warriors would have defeated Braddock and his men if they hadn't had to devote so much time and energy into building that road through the Allegheny Mountains. What do you think? You can find more information about David, his book, Braddocks Defeat, plus everything we talked about today on the blog post page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/060. Would you like to ask our guest historians questions? You should join Poor Richard's Club. Almost every week, I post an interview topic with a call for questions. To join Poor Richard's Club, text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com and sign up for the listener community. Have you joined the Ben Franklin's World movement yet? If you would like to help restore history to the forefront of the public mind and help support this show, please visit benfranklinsworld.com/movement or text support BFWorld to 33444 for more information. Finally, I am really interested in what you think about the role Braddocks Road played in the Battle of the Monongahela. What do you think would have happened if the British had enjoyed an easy road to Fort Duquesne? Do you think the battle would have turned out differently? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the blog post page for this episode or in Poor Richard's Club.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.